Hey, welcome everybody to another Veterans for Peace convention. 2021. I know a lot of folks were hoping that we would be in person gathering this year, but it still is much safer to do an online convention, and it's accessible in a lot of ways. So I'm glad y'all are here. I'm Garrett Repnhagen. I'm the executive director of Veterans for Peace. And if you don't know me, I served in Iraq as a U.S. Army sniper for a year, and Kosovo for 9 months as a peacekeeper, quote unquote. And I've been dealing with the moral injury of harming folks in other worlds ever since. So it's driven me to activism, and it's driven me to this position. So I'm the first post 9/11 veteran to take on the position of executive director for Veterans for Peace. And Veterans for Peace has a long tradition of veterans just like myself. We go back to 1985, and a lot of our roots come from Vietnam Veterans Against the War, whose a lot of their roots come from war resistors and GI resistance that spans much deeper than that. So it's a long tradition of folks fighting for justice and fighting for anti-militarism. So thanks again for being here. Our theme this year is rising to the moment, and it really feels like it captured what we want for this convention. It's short and simple, maybe ambiguous, but I feel like the moment is clear. I think we all feel it from these intersectional crises that are impacting us, from climate, nuclear, racial justice. The list goes on and on. Health concerns. It really highlights the fact that many people around the world, and especially the Western world, are prioritizing capitalism and militarism over human beings, over people. And it's time to act. So it's time to rise. And what does rising mean? I feel like rising means more than temporary mobilizations. We need to organize. We need to build power, and we need to change more to an organizing culture. What does that mean? We need real campaign development, pathways to participate for everybody, continued skill training, communities of solidarity. We need consistent and principled actions. We need leadership development. We need to build deep relationships. And we're going to perfect exactly what organizing culture really means to Veterans for Peace. And I think it's going to be a driving force to how we organize in the future. And I'm excited to do that with folks. Let's rise to the moment now. I'm going to move on to our land acknowledgement. This year, fellow staff member Gail Aquino is going to give a statement that Gail wrote. And Gail's been a staff member for Veterans for Peace for a long time and has held down the fort in a lot of different areas. But if you ever received anything in the mail from Veterans for Peace, at least in the last 5 or so years, it probably came from Gail. So she handles a lot of stuff behind the scenes, and happens to be Indigenous Hawaiian. So I'd love, Gail, for you to deliver the statement that you prepared.
Okay, thank you, Garrett. Aloha ahi ahi, good evening. My name is Gail Aquino. I was born and raised on the island of Maui, Hawaii. My dad is Filipino, Spanish. My mom is Hawaiian, Portuguese, Spanish, Chinese, and English. I consider myself a poly-Asian. I grew up in a culture of Filipino and Hawaiian ways, part of which is deep respect and honor for my elders. I am also a staff member of Veterans for Peace, and a veteran myself, having served in Baghdad in 2005. I recently spoke to a friend of mine who is a Native American Cherokee descendant. I asked her what land acknowledgement meant to her. Her response was that the terminology needs to change or be updated. In her opinion, it equates to ownership of land. but more so it should be caretaking of lands, because the indigenous people's way of looking at the land is different from non-indigenous people. She feels that indigenous people look at the land, she feels that non-indigenous people look at the land as money, where indigenous people look at it as we are the caretakers of this land and we need to respect it. In Hawaii, a similar phrase we use is he ali'i ka'aina, he kauwa ke kanaka. The land is the chief, man is its servant. I know that many of you are watching all over the country. If you want to know the roots of the land of which you now sit, please use the website that we will put in the chat. As some of you may or may not know, Hawaii has a long legacy of colonization that still continues today, where our culture was made illegal and even the practice of hula, denounced as heathen, was soon banned as it was a pagan ritual dance with moves the missionaries saw as vulgar, disgusting, and sinful. Today, we are still seeing the impacts of how people not from here are using Hawaii in ways that are not respectful and take advantage of the islands. In fact, when I was in Baghdad, the sound of bombs reminded me of the sound of home, because I grew up hearing the target practice of the US military when they were releasing bombs on the island of Kaho'olawe. My hope for Hawaii is that she will always stay Hawaii. I want visitors and transplants to respect our way of life, to respect our lands, to respect our traditions, to respect our people, and to respect our culture. It is everyone's kuleana to take care of one another, respect one another, and respect the land. If we do not do that, in my opinion, Hawaii as we know it will not exist. It will be just another white vacation destination for the rich and privileged, or a place where the US military can take away and misuse ancestral lands. I want our younger generation to be able to stay or return to our islands. I want no one to grow up hearing the sounds of bombs. The spirit of aloha is within us. It is our heart, our soul, and our respect for one another, and our aina, our land. It is our mana, our life force, or as I like to say, our heartbeat. It is also our kuleana, responsibility and duty, to take care of one another and our land. It is not necessarily something you learn, it is a feeling deep within ourselves. Today, I want to take a moment of silence for all of us to honor all of our responsibility to the land and to those who have taken care of it, and to consider the ways in which we can all take better care of the land, ourselves, each other, and how we can better honor and respect the legacy of the original indigenous people of these lands. Let's have a moment of silence. Thank you, and I will leave you with Ua mau ke'ea o ka'aina i ka pono. The life of the land is perpetuated in righteousness.
Thank you, Gail. I really appreciate that. It's it's a call. So, I think we should all take heed and thank you, Gail, for always bringing the aloha spirit into the office and keeping everybody light. And you do a fantastic job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we heard last year from Ellie Painted Crow, who's running a workshop in this convention. Land acknowledgements are kind of like, we steal a car and we're driving around the neighborhood telling people that we just stole the car. So, it's this awkward, uncomfortable thing about land acknowledgements, And then another uncomfortable thing is organizational acknowledgements. We live in the Western world. We live under, traditions of colonization, white supremacy, patriarchy, hierarchy, and that exists, within our own country, within a lot of our communities, and within Veterans for Peace. So we struggle every day to improve and be better. So we got to be mindful of these things. Every meeting, we try to bring up read our statement of purpose and our code of conduct. This year, we've had the pleasure of being able to record both our statement of purpose and code of conduct. Our statement of purpose grounds us in what our mission is. And the code of conduct is why we do that mission. I think it's, based around how we want to treat each other. And I'm just going to share my screen. I'm going to play these videos, and here we go.
All right, action.
I am a veteran of the Army National Guard,
of the United States Navy,
the United States Air Force,
Of the U.S. Army.
And I am a veteran of the American War in Vietnam.
and I've been a member of Veterans for Peace
for 2.5 years.
15 years.
Close to 30 years now.
for about a month now.
for over 1 year.
An active member for 20 years.
We as military veterans do hereby affirm our greater responsibility
To serve the cause of world peace. To this end, we will work with others both nationally and internationally
To increase public awareness of the causes and costs of war.
to restrain our government
From intervening overtly and covertly in the internal affairs
of other nations,
To end the arms race,
To reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons.
to seek justice for veterans and victims of war,
to abolish war as an instrument of national policy,
to achieve these goals, members of Veterans for Peace pledge to use nonviolent means
and to maintain an organization that is both democratic and open.
With the understanding that all members are trusted to act in the best interests of the group.
for the larger purpose of world peace.
Okay, now I'm going to run the code of conduct here.
Ready, get set, action.
We will use our anger at injustice as a positive, nonviolent force for change.
We will approach every encounter with fellow members and the public with positivity and mindfulness.
And with the assumption that concerns raised are coming from a positive place.
and present a learning opportunity.
Our attitude
As conveyed through our words,
Symbols and actions.
Will be one of openness, friendliness,
and respect towards all people we encounter.
all members have an important role to play in Veterans for Peace.
regardless of previous military rank, branch, or combat experience.
We will respect one another as equal parts of a whole.
We will not assault verbally, in person, or online anyone,
To include fellow members and those who oppose or disagree with us.
Even if they assault us.
This does not preclude a member's right
To defend themselves
Against a physical attack.
In keeping with our commitment to achieving our goals through nonviolent means,
There is an expectation that members will not carry weapons with them.
to Veterans for Peace events,
Or while representing Veterans for Peace.
Regardless of the laws and their location.
We will follow the directions of designated coordinators.
During public actions,
organized on behalf of Veterans for Peace.
We'll use democratic principles within our organization to ensure an open, fair, inclusive, and transparent environment.
We will speak as members of Veterans for Peace,
but not for Veterans for Peace.
Unless designated as a spokesperson for Veterans for Peace.
All members are free to speak for themselves or on behalf of their chapter as appropriate.
Sexist,
Racist,
homophobic,
ageist,
transphobic,
Gender discriminatory
and all other discriminatory language and actions
are common within the military.
They are not acceptable within Veterans for Peace.
our words and actions will maintain
The political and financial independence of Veterans for Peace.
To achieve the above goals, we will also engage in active listening.
that is fully concentrating on what is being said,
rather than passively hearing the message of the speaker.
That outstanding video was created by Jules, our new membership coordinator. And thanks, Jules, for your hard work in that and everybody who participated there. Hopefully we can make more tools for you all and make those available. So instead of reading the code of conduct at your meetings and the statement of purpose, you could just play the videos. And I think they're great ways for new folks to be introduced to Veterans for Peace and hear kind of what we're about. So it's been a year since our last convention. Our last convention, Human Rights Over Nuclear Might, obviously was supposed to be in Albuquerque, and we were going to do some incredible actions with the support of the Albuquerque chapter there. You know, it's a lot has changed obviously since then, and a lot hasn't. But you know, we've been set upon this path in a health crisis, in a racial justice uprising, growing militarism, a changing of presidential power. You know, our paradigms are always changing, and with it, VFP has to change as well. You know, we have to adapt, and we have to be able to stand beside you know, movements, spaces, you know, and you know, we have to reflect our values as an organization. And to do that, you know, there's some changes I think that we have to make within Veterans for Peace and within ourselves. We have to grow. So you know, I hope everybody was able to check out the trainings today. I thought they were incredible. The allyship training was outstanding. It's exactly the kind of resources that we need as an organization and as a people. And you know, we heard about media and communications training, new tools that we can use to get our message out and to not only build a communications platform to go one way out into the audience, but to build a community using those tools. And I thought that was really cool. And then the facilitator training was absolutely essential. I imagine every one of us runs meetings. I don't know how you organize without a gathering of people and ideas. So please catch out the facilitator training. All this stuff is recorded, and you could watch it afterwards. If it's not up there really soon after the event, it should be at least within the next day. So if you miss an event, you can't see something, go back in the calendar, check it out later. You should be able to watch all the recorded stuff on the convention website as we move forward. So 20 years ago, September 11th, 9/11 tragedy. It's crazy. I joined the US military 1 month before September 11th, and it certainly changed the course of my life. And we've been, in a lot of ways, just reacting to this in the last 20 years. You know, it's crazy how we've used this tool, how people in power have used this tool to manipulate Americans into endless war. And I know many of you have been in this fight for a long time, but we're going to have some cool panels talking about that at this convention as well. You know, I don't want to labor on too long. We really do have a powerful event coming up, but I do want to give you a little highlight of what's coming. After this panel tonight, we're going to have the president's reception, and it's in the social room. And if you go all the way to the bottom of the schedule, you'll find a link to the social room, and that'll be available for the entire convention. So if you need to just check in, carry on a conversation from a panel or workshop, just connect with old friends. We're really trying to recreate that, family reunion feeling that you might get from a physical convention. That's a great place to allow that to happen. Just remember, it's not hosted and it's not facilitated in there. So make sure it runs smoothly. Step up, step back. Use some of those tools we learned in the facilitation training to kind of regulate yourself in there, and make sure you hit mute, when you walk away or you're done talking, so folks don't hear all the background noise when you walk away, because there's no host to mute you. You have to do that on your own. We have yoga almost all mornings. So if you want to center yourself before dealing with some powerful content during the convention, that's a cool way to do it. The yoga session on Sunday has been replaced by VFP moving forward. So if we want to use some of these tools and things that we've talked about as far as creating equitable spaces, that's a good place to have that conversation Sunday morning. We have workshops all tomorrow. We have really, really great workshops. And I know it's difficult to choose the one that you want to go to. Just remember, you can go see the other ones. They're all going to be recorded. We have movement lessons learned from Peace at Home. And it's going to be a cool panel with a handful of presenters really reflecting on what they had to change in the last years, how they shifted organizing structures, practices to deal with new paradigms, like I was talking about. We have the poetry on that evening. I think we have a lot of poets that are going to be performing there for us. So please come there with an open heart. The business meeting, as usual, is on Saturday. You have to be a member, dues paying member, to attend the business meeting. It's not on the schedule. Folks will get their own link to get into that business meeting if you're a member. So if you're not a member, join up. The keynote speaker that evening is Viet Thanh Nguyen, Vietnamese author, fictional author that uses fictional stories to bring up social justice and war-related issues. It's going to be a very, I think, intimate discussion, and you would be sad to miss it. And we're going to do our awards, our presente, and then followed up with a musical celebration with Watermelon Slim and Crash and some more incredible artists. Sunday, we're going to have a panel, 20 years since 9/11, veteran anti-militarism organizing. So we're going to look back at the last 20 years, specifically around veterans and what they've been doing in this space. Nida Crawford will be our closing keynote speaker that evening. And then we still have more content even after the closing ceremony. We're going to have a panel about drones and whistleblowers with Brandon Bryant and some of our drone specialists in and around the organization. And then there's a film called Medicating Normal that folks can catch with a panel around the film talking about problems with over medication and the connections with the VA and our pharmaceutical systems. So that's going to be our powerful convention. I hope everybody can take part of it. I hope this convention can continue to be a tool of change and help move the organization where we need to be. And I appreciate everybody's incredible work throughout the year and for the years to come. So thanks, everyone. On to our panel. Our intersectional panel is led by Michael Messner, who just recently wrote a book called Unconventional Combat. This book is, this book obviously talks about unconventional combat as far as the challenges and barriers that many marginalized people have in the US military. But those habits and those problems don't stop there. They move on towards even activist spaces, even spaces like ours that are supposed to be committed towards building peace in the world. And sometimes we're not, most of the time, we're not even peaceful to each other. And we harm the folks that are closest to us, our people who should be our comrades. And, you know, I think this is a great book. It's going to help us really kind of reflect on ourselves and analyze ourselves as an organization, as a movement. And the folks who've been interviewed for the book, they've given a gift to us, and we should receive it like that. So Michael Messner is going to lead us through this panel. Messner is an associate member of Veterans for Peace, professor of sociology and gender studies at the University of Southern California. He's the author and editor of 19 books on gender-based violence, men, feminism, gender, and sports. Recently, Messner conducted research with U.S. military veterans who are advocates for peace and social justice. The first book based on this research, Guys Like Me, 5 Wars, 5 Veterans for Peace, was published in 2019. The new book, Unconventional Combat, which I just talked about, Intersectional Action, and the Veterans Peace Movement, is hot off the press. So, Michael, the floor is yours. Please stay tuned and witness this incredible panel. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thanks very much, Garrett, and thanks to all of the organizers of the convention, and also especially for having faith in this session and placing it in such an important slot in the program. I'm hoping we can set a template for discussing really important issues. As Garrett said, my name is Mike Messner, and I'm an associate member of Veterans for Peace and affiliated with the Santa Fe, New Mexico chapter. And I'm also a sociologist, and for the past few years, as Garrett said, I've been interviewing and doing research with veterans who are advocates for peace and social justice. And as that first book, Guys Like Me, was coming out in 2019, that book focuses almost exclusively on men, I noticed that there was a younger generation of veterans who were joining Veterans for Peace, and some of them were moving into leadership positions in the organization. So the new book, Unconventional Combat, Intersectional Action in the Veterans Peace Movement, chronicles the experiences of a group of these younger veterans, all of them Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC, some of them queer identified, most of them women and or gender non-binary people. And I track their experiences before, during, and following their time in the military, as well as their entry into VFP and or about face. Using deep life history interviews, I explore how this younger, diverse cohort of post 9/11 veterans experiences have shaped their understandings of how militarism is linked with racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia. While their commitments to peace and anti-militarism echo those of longtime members of VFP, many of whom, as you know, are white men of the Vietnam War era, their collective knowledge of gendered racism differently shapes their experiences within VFP, as well as their ideas and actions, their praxis in forging coalition politics. The stories of this new generation of veterans bring into focus some troubling strains and tensions in the Veterans Peace Movement, and their intersectional praxis holds promise to take the movement to another level. It's this mix of peril and promise that shapes today's panel discussion. I have 3 questions to which I've asked each of the panelists to respond. The wording of each question implies a set of problems or dilemmas facing VFP and more broadly the Veterans Peace Movement. And I've urged the panelists not to shy away from discussing these problems. But each question also points us toward critical dialogue that we hope will move us toward productive solutions that are consistent with the theme of this year's convention, rising to the moment. So we have 4 panelists, and I'm a little worried to say that there are only 2 of them so far in the room. Hopefully they will be coming in as we move forward, but I will introduce all 4 of them, and then I will ask the first question. The first 2 panelists are featured in the book. And the first one is Wendy Bronco. Many of you know her. Wendy is a community organizer and U.S. Army veteran of the Iraq occupation, 05-06, as a combat medic. She holds a Master of Arts in Urban Sustainability. And Wendy also has been very active in using the skills and knowledge that she has from her work as a combat medic in doing social justice work during the pandemic in Los Angeles and other work also in Tijuana. Brittany Ramos de Barros is a proud Afro-Latina Staten Islander, community organizer, and combat veteran running for Congress in New York's 11th District. And I urge you to have a look at her, her campaign website online. She grew up in a deeply patriotic military family and entered the Army in order to help pay for college. De Barros' time in Afghanistan changed her mind about war as she came home angry, hurt, and feeling betrayed by a system that covered up greed and corruption with the veneer of freedom. She quickly realized that these same problems were happening at home, across the country, and directly within her own community. De Barros is determined to help lead the fight to build a better, more just world, the world that we deserve. Kenneth E Mayers is the next speaker. The Marine Corps paid Ken's way through Princeton as an NROTC scholarship holder. He graduated with a degree in electrical engineering in 1958 and accepted a commission as a regular Marine Corps officer, intending to make the service his career. However, his experience as an instrument of US foreign policy drove him out of the Corps. In 1986, Ken was recruited into Veterans for Peace by then President John Barr, another former career Marine Corps officer. In July 2002, Ken co-founded the Santa Fe chapter of VFP. Ken was a member of the National VFP Board of Directors from 2004 to 2009 and National Treasurer from 2005 through 2009. He was again elected in 2020. And fourth, we have Chantelle Bateman. Chantelle describes herself as a mama, an artist, and an entrepreneur living and working in Philadelphia. She has been part of the veterans demilitarization movement as an organizer, strategist, and advisor since joining About Face, formerly known as Iraq Veterans Against the War, in 2008. So I'll ask each of these questions separately, and I've asked the panelists to respond in 4 or 5 minutes each to each of these questions. And the questions really kind of track chapters 3, 4, and 5 in the book on conventional combat. The first question really looks inward into the dynamics of Veterans for Peace as an organization. And it looks especially at the issue of the distinction between a commitment to diversity to a commitment to full inclusiveness. Now, the veterans that I highlight in the book, many of them found their way into Veterans for Peace and found the door open and a sort of welcome from longtime members who are committed to diversity, and then found themselves bumping up many times against overt and sometimes covert barriers to full inclusiveness. And I think this is an issue that VFP needs to talk about, but it's also an issue that's really live right now across the whole social movement spectrum. And it's even alive in progressive political or professional organizations such as mine. I'm a sociologist, and I've had to learn and to think much more self-critically over the past few years about my own commitment to diversity, recruiting graduate students, assistant professors to work with me and in my department who don't, quote, look like me, to move beyond that commitment to building diversity, to understanding that when you bring people in who don't look like you, they oftentimes don't also have the same experiences that you have had. They don't have the same goals that you have. They don't have the same sort of sense of what the strategy of your organization should be. In my case, what research should look like, how we should act in the classroom. So the first question, and I'll ask Wendy to lead off for us. The first question is, how can the Veterans Peace Movement, particularly organizations like VFP, move from a commitment to diversity to a commitment to full inclusiveness, which means embracing a younger generation of leadership from BIPOC, women, LGBTQ+ veterans. Wendy?
Thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone. Excited to be here. I just want to name a couple of things. Thank you so much for that question. I think there's a lot there, and I'm going to try to stick to my time. I just want to recognize that there's, for me personally, a lot of anxiety. This isn't the first, there's a lot of history here around this conversation, particularly as it pertains to VFP. And so I just want to name that and put it out there. And so really my purpose here participating in this panel is to match the curiosity, hopefully, and the expectations for folks who are, as I hear, you know, the chat going off and everything, who want to learn and who want to grow, right, with folks together and have that co-evolution. So I just wanted to name that. Additionally, you know, this question of diversity and inclusiveness really for me has two underlying assumptions that I would like to kind of make explicit. The first is this question of like diversity, right? Which for me, I think carries kind of an unnamed assumption of checking the box, where we get caught up in like racial and gender, sex, class categories, right? And so it becomes really easy, particularly for organizations and companies, to just say, well, you know, we hired a Black person, we hired a brown person, like, what's the problem, right? And so there's that. And so that's one piece. And then the other piece of it is the inclusiveness piece, which is like, it's well-meaning, and I think it operates in good faith. But I also think that without a proper organization structure that's explicitly anti-racist, then people of color, women, trans folks, queer folks, disabled folks who come into that organization could not only just get tokenized, but also get harmed by that organization. And, you know, we see this process time and time again, particularly in the nonprofit industrial complex, where women of color, particularly, as it has been my experience and I've seen to other women of color happen, they come into organization, it's all well-meaning, they get this, you know, so-called power, but it's not actual power, right? And so I would offer, you know, more, that language matters, and we could move more to equity, perhaps, and justice, right? What does equity look like? What does justice look like? And start thinking in those terms. So this is by no means a comprehensive list. I could talk about this topic forever. And I'll let other folks, of course, have their time. I think it's a very, it's a great sign that we're having this discussion, period. I will say that. And I think the fact that we're rallying around this book, the fact that this book exists in and of itself is a point, right? Is a standalone point around like the arguments that we're making here. So one of the things that I think is super helpful on a personal scale is a kind of cultural humility, right? Emily Akay has talked about like how the white liberal has an aspect of superiority that folks think that they have nothing to learn, right? And I think that that's part, like the majority of the battle in a lot of these conversations that we have is like when folks approach the table with a kind of humility around, I have things to learn, right? An elder did put to me at one point, you know, there's a difference between an elder and an older. An older person is not willing to learn. And an elder is a person who is constantly reflecting and critical thinking, right? So I'm here particularly for those people who are here with that curiosity, who are looking to build that muscle. And then the other part too is like cultivating a culture of accountability that I think is super, also a personal thing, but also an organizational thing for folks. And that in turn means, you know, again, I could go on forever about like accountability and what that looks like, but really I think it's a discipline, right? A personal discipline around being the ability to be wrong, the ability to make amends, the ability to repair, the ability to learn, which goes hand in hand with the humility piece. And then finally, I would say the recognition to move in right relationship with other communities with whom we do not belong to, right? And I think we've signaled that and kind of alluded to that with the acknowledgement piece, the land acknowledgement piece at the beginning of the proceedings here. But there's also a deeper radicalization, right, that we look at with campaigns like Land Back and Defending Line 3, etc. So I'll stop there. I think I was good on time. How am I good on time?
You are fine on time, but if you want to make another point to wrap, that's fine.
Okay, cool. So, and I also want to highlight a necessity to kind of to learn more and radicalize around the feminist economy, right? Particularly with a group that is white, that is privileged, that is largely overwhelmingly male. I haven't looked at the latest statistics for VFP. But that's speaking from my personal experience, personal historic interactions, right? And it's little things like when you're at events and it's the women, right? It's the folks who identify as women who are charged with the domestic and the carekeeping, and who's bringing this and who's bringing that, right? And so I encourage folks with male privilege, with white privilege, to lean more into the caretaking and the domestic labor that it takes to get this organizing off the ground, because largely, as I have seen, it falls on women, on folks who identify as women. So that's the reproductive and domestic labor. And again, there's more, but I want to, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Wendy. Brittany, welcome.
Thanks, Mike. Should I just jump in, or did you want to re-ask the question? Okay. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much to everyone who put together the work for this, for this convention. It's so good for us to be together, even though we're on take 2 of COVID resurgence, it seems. So I'm glad I can still be with you all virtually, at least. I have to say that at, my very first VFP convention, I ended up being, just spontaneously added to a conversation, a panel about GI resistance. At the time, I was still in the middle of, being investigated by the Army for speaking out while I was in uniform, and, really just learning the ropes of the veteran movement, anti-war movement as it existed. And this was only a few years ago, really. And it's so funny that this is the question today, because that is the question I ended up being asked as a young woman of color who, was in the middle of being investigated and all these things. Folks in the audience ended up asking, how can we engage more post 9/11 veterans? How can we get more women involved? How can we get more people of color involved? And, I think it's telling that I was prepared with a 5-point answer even then already to that answer. I think that should say a lot about how pressing and obvious, I think, to those of us who, do fit that criteria, that this issue has been in our spaces. But, I think it was also telling, and I say this with deep love for our spaces, but I think that it was also telling that one of the first things I said was, don't just talk at us. Don't just treat us like, oh, new people, almost like fresh meat, right? And then come up to us and just talk at us. Like, let's be an actual relationship and conversation on equal footing. And that's not to say that I don't, I think I said then that I don't have a lot to learn from folks who have been in this struggle for so long. But I also think that humility to acknowledge that you might have things to learn from me, who is connected to this generation that's coming up, and folks who, who are just getting out of the military or who are just joining the movement, right? That is a two-way street, and let's treat it like one. And after I finished saying that, there was a line of members, mostly older white men, who lined up. And I remember it viscerally because I was kind of awkwardly standing against a wall. I was awkward in my skin in a veteran space. I hadn't really been in a veteran space like that before. It was overwhelming. So I was kind of awkwardly standing against the wall. And there was this line of mostly older white men. And every one of them, as they stepped up, talked at me. And the question had just been asked and answered, about how can we engage differently? How can we engage in a way that makes people feel like they're not just welcomed, but that they're respected, they're wanted, and that there's a place not just in participation, but potentially in leadership, and that the knowledge that they potentially bring is respected, right? And yet there was just this one after another of people who so kind. They were so kind, so, they were well-meaning, gracious. They were saying nice things many of the times, and yet not a single one of them asked me a question. Not a single one of them asked me how I was feeling, or how we could follow up and work together. It was just one after another of talking at me, many of them for 3 to 5 minutes at a time, just talking at me without a single actual two-way street engagement offered or kind of invited. And so it is a real full circle moment for me to be back in this plenary, and I'm so grateful to be back. And I've continued to engage because I believe that there are so many leaders who are committed to cultivating a space where I think not just as diverse, not just as inclusive, but where power flows differently. And I think that piece is important. And so that kind of moves me into my next reflection, which is just that I think that so often we think about this as kindness. We think about this as a kind of righteousness. And yet I think too often we don't think about this issue as an issue of power. And so, one of my short answers to how do we change, how do we create, is that we shouldn't be striving for inclusiveness. Inclusiveness is great, and yet it still supposes that we should be welcoming Indigenous people, Black people, women, gender nonconforming people, et cetera, into a space that was designed by white people, predominantly by white men. And that welcoming is so beautiful. And it's not to reject that welcoming. I think many people have had their lives changed. They've found community. There have been good things. But what I'm saying is that if we actually want to take things to the next level, what that is about transformation. And that's about power. And that's about understanding that means that a structure that was not built by us or for us is never going to truly feel like it's for us until there's transformation. And so, I think when we think about power, in my years in the anti-war movement so far, what I've seen is we so often have two extremes of how we relate to power. We sometimes have this kind of like very shallow, almost easily co-optive understanding of power that is almost power blind, right? We navigate the electoral system, the nonprofit system, capitalism, all of these things as if there aren't power dynamics in these spaces, and that hasn't served us. I think the other extreme is that we're so hungry for our vision of the future that we operate as if we are living there, and we fail to navigate and to be willing to do the very messy and uncomfortable work of navigating real contradictions that exist in building transformative, powerful movements that can get at the very structures of power that are outside of us in real ways. And I think we see that in our political strategy. I think we see that in the way that we relate to a lot of things, where the opposite of, it's almost to the other extreme of power blindness, where we make our decisions, our interventions based on this kind of moralism and self-righteousness that says, I want to be the most right in the room. I want to be the most moral in the room. And one example of the way I see this, manifested is that and this is maybe going to be an unpopular thing, and there's a whole lot to unpack here. So let me just say this is an oversimplification. But leading up to the 2020 elections, for me, looking around, seeing my communities struggling, having been under constant attack for years, at a pace that, yes, continues under neoliberalism. We always knew it would continue under neoliberalism, and yet the nakedness, the intensity, the aggressiveness of that was different, and it impacted our organizing. And yet I saw so many people whose only argument, I think that there are good arguments for not participating in the electoral system, and yet I'm dissatisfied with arguments that are limited to the analysis that says, I won't vote for them because I'm so righteous. That my individual righteousness and moralism is more important than navigating in power in collective. And I think that, you know, for me, that's an invitation for us to challenge the ways that we talk about the symptoms of violence, the manifestations of state power here and around the world, that we have to be willing to be rigorous and militant in understanding that we are in a landscape that is hostile. We are not on even territory. We are navigating hostile territory, and we are in a life or death struggle for many people around us and many people around the world at the heart of the beast, at the heart of empire. And we have to be willing to navigate and grapple with the real contradictions of confronting power in order to gain power, direct political power, whatever that means in your political analysis and in your strategic analysis. But my point here is that when we navigate these systems from a place of understanding power analysis and with a particular theory of change that is about a goal to transform the way that power flows in our society, which I think is at the heart of anti-war work, then we have to contend with what it means to have a power analysis around the interventions that hit at the heart of those structures. And again, I'm not here to say that there's one strategy, but I have been dissatisfied. It's its own form of capitalist individualism to say that the only motivations for my movements in a room are to be the smartest in the room, or my only motivations in how I relate to a ballot box are to be the best leftist, the best Marxist, the best whatever. We have to be rooted in the reality of the material conditions of our people. And we have to be militant and struggling to confront power and to take power. And I think when you do that, you cannot help but transform. And I think that that's how that connects to our movements, because I think that when you're moving from that place, you cannot help but transform, because you can't unsee the way that power flows. And you can't unsee the ways that there are connections between, you know, through the flow of power across the systems of oppression that we seek to undo. I'll stop there.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you, Brittany. I always learn so much from Wendy and Brittany. Thank you so much. And before turning over to Ken, I wanted to mention that also that another of the wonderful vets that I profile in the book, Monisha Rios, is in the room, and I've seen her commenting in the chat, and I hope that when we get to the Q&A, Monisha will allow you to maybe have first crack at any points or questions you would like to add. So Ken Mayers.
Thanks, Mike. It's terrific listening to these women. I learned tremendously from them. I'm so grateful to Mike for producing this book, because I think it's something that my first answer.
Hey, Ken.
Yes.
Can you come closer to your microphone maybe, and maybe adjust your volume? I'm not sure what you did the other day, but it seemed to do the trick, and it's hard to hear you.
Okay, sorry.
That's better.
Okay. Yeah, the first step that I recommend to my colleagues and Veterans for Peace in addressing Mike's question is get Mike's book and read it. It's going to make a lot of us uncomfortable because it reveals our shortcomings in confronting the new realities. Basically, I'd say that we had a problem. We were all ready for inclusiveness. I think most Veterans for Peace were. But frankly, we lacked the skill set. There's so much that's been learned and conveyed to us in the last couple of decades that we weren't ready for, so that we were delighted to see people like Brittany and Wendy come to Veterans for Peace, but we didn't know how to deal with it, frankly, effectively. There was a terrific workshop on allyship this morning that kind of addressed many of these issues, and I would urge my friends who missed that workshop to go back and view it sometime during the course of this convention. And I think both Brittany and Wendy touched on something that frankly, Michael, you missed in the question, and that's equity. One of the things that we didn't have tools for, didn't have the understanding for, was the necessity of opening up equity in our movement to people who weren't like us old white men. I think another thing I would recommend is members join the Veterans for Peace book club, the Be the Change book club, where we have been trying to educate ourselves on some of these very things. You know, we've done we've read and discussed white fragility, me and white supremacy, and I think it's been eye-opening for a lot of us, even those of us involved in peace and justice movements as long as I have, which has been since I resigned my commission in 1966. It requires deep listening, deep understanding, and something that my grandmother taught many years ago, and that was that we should seek more to understand than to be understood. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ken. I'm having trouble navigating my screen sometimes. I'm just leaving myself unmuted because my mute and unmute button seems not to be working. Nor can I move the screen to get back to my second question. So I will wing it without reading it. And the second question really focuses more into what I focus on in chapter 4 in the book. If chapter 3 focuses in on the internal dynamics of Veterans for Peace, chapter 4 focuses out on how does Veterans for Peace and About Face connect with other social justice organizations. There's an ongoing dilemma that any social justice organization faces of trying to balance how much to keep connected to the mission of the organization, in this case, peace and anti-militarism, and how much and how to connect to other social justice or anti-colonial efforts. And to make a very broad generalization, what I found with the research for the book was the older members of Veterans for Peace, if you think of people kind of straddling with one foot in the organization, Veterans for Peace, and one foot kind of moving perhaps into other organizations, racial justice work, climate action work, that the older generation of Veterans for Peace tends to keep more of their weight on that foot that's in the organization and sticking to what's often called the mission of the organization. Although there's a tremendous legacy of coalition work done by Ken Mayers and many other people in Veterans for Peace over the years. The younger generation and this more diverse generation of veterans, I find, tends to put more of their weight forward into connecting into other organizations. And either of those sorts of choices involve trying to avoid doing the splits, because we can't all do everything all the time. But if you are moving most of your organizational energy into other organizations, into racial justice with the Black Lives Matter uprisings, into climate justice action, you risk kind of pulling the limited energy that you have to sustain an organization of Veterans for Peace or About Face. So the question I've asked folks on the panel to address is, how do we best move forward as an organization, or as organizations, if we're also including About Face, with building sustainable social justice and anti-colonial coalitions, all the time realizing that organizations like BFP have limited size and membership, and people will have to face burnout problems with trying to do everything all the time. But at the same time, from my point of view, it's so important for organizations like VFP and About Face to be in the world, not just to spread the message that you all have about peace, but also to bring the anti-militarist perspective into other organizations that don't necessarily understand the links between, for instance, militarism and war and climate change, the links between militarism and war and the injustices that we see at the US-Mexico border. And it's you folks that have the ability to make those kind of connections and are making those connections. So Wendy, we'll go to you first on that one.
Thanks. This is a great question. And I also think it's already happening, right? Folks are already doing that work. But before I think we get into that, Brittany was sharing her story, and it reminded me of my own time when I was a part of another VFP panel in San Diego. And, I was talking about the importance of supporting Black Lives Matter. I don't know how long ago this was. And immediately the next panelist that was invited and brought from overseas immediately contradicted and said, we have to focus on the mission, right? And I think we get so caught up in the mission sometimes that we haven't seen how the mission has transformed into this, as About Face says, like this many tentacled military industrial complex, right? And so when one says Black Lives Matter, we're also talking about the militarization of police. We're also talking about the border, right? It's all intertwined. Yeah, exactly, Colleen. So I'm putting that out there because I'm resonating a lot with everything that's been said. And I also just want to affirm the history, right? And the context of these discussions. So a lot of it is already happening. As I said, I want to particularly highlight like the work that folks with the book club are doing as a collective, because I really think it's important to get our own house in order, right? And get our own work in order, which is not to say that will ever be done, right? We're both allowed to be a masterpiece and a work in progress. But I think that it's important, in order to be in right relationship with different movements, to come in a way that, as Brittany has said, is respectful, is in right relationship, and getting our own house in order. And so I think it would behoove particularly this group to leave the white savior complex at home, right? That a lot of, in my opinion, folks like to do when relating to movements, particularly when relating to Indigenous peoples. And so I want to highlight that. I also want to highlight again on the tip, and when I'm talking about like domestic labor and reproductive labor, the book, the political education piece and the conversations taking place around that are of the utmost importance, because they're happening collectively, right? So they need more buy-in. And so I want to shout out Kathleen and Ken, who have, and other folks in that group have continued, right? And it's my understanding that the book will also be discussed there. So I want to encourage more folks to have more buy-in in that. And then Another win, I think, as well, that I think needs to be highlighted is the work at the border with deported veterans. There was just a huge legislative victory here that folks, the San Diego chapter of VFP, the LA chapter of VFP, particularly our ally members like Kathleen, like Mike, et cetera, have been working over years, right, in one way or another. So I think there's something to be said about the work that's already happening there, but I definitely I will die on this hill that this is a continual thing to work on, right? It's not, smarter people than I have said it is not enough to be anti-racist. You must actively be looking at that and continuing to work on that, right? And so I would encourage that at a personal scale, and I would also encourage that on a collective scale. And I think that to a large degree that's happening around the book. And yes, thank you, Monisha. I'm going to read Monisha's comment, like, who is defining the mission, right? Who is defining the quote unquote work? Does it come from an understanding of racial capitalism, colonialism, imperialism? This linear colonial thinking is part of the what needs to be unlearned. Exactly. Thank you, Monisha. And so I couldn't agree with that more, and I'm really glad that she's here. And then the last thing that I'll say on this is that I think white people, and just white males in particular, white men, need to get comfortable with following, right? And if you're not going to follow, like my grandma used to say, if you're not going to help, get out of the way, right? And I think that that's it's a very kind of threatening position, particularly folks who are used to having power historically in this country, who have set up systems to have power in this country. And I get it, right? But if we are operating from a place of collective liberation, we also understand that whiteness is a poison to y'all too, right? And that it strips you of your humanity. To be human, it dehumanizes you. And so this is a win-win situation for everybody. And so get comfortable with following women of color, get comfortable with following Black folks, get comfortable with following women, trans folks, queer folks, disabled folks, which is a practice, that's not a muscle that just grows overnight. Yes, so I'm just checking out the comments that are really amazing. I'll stop there. That's all I have to say on that.
Thanks, Wendy. And I'd add to your point about whiteness being a disease that hurts all of us. So is narrow definitions of masculinity, particularly militarized masculinity, that I think also spill into veterans progressive organizations in ways that can be very toxic. And I think that's one of the things I've learned from you and others who I have featured in the book. Brittany?
Thanks. Yeah. So I think my shortest answer to this is I think we need to be broad in our analysis and precise in our tactics. Because I do think mission creep and trying to do everything ultimately hurts the movement. It hurts our ability to gain power and to make targeted interventions that allow us to gain ground and shift our conditions. So I think that that's a real problem that we have to contend with. And so I think when we think about the movement, I think about the movement as a broad working class movement beyond our borders, right? Working class people around the world. And I think that there are sectors of that movement that are points of intervention. And I think that, when you understand it that way, it becomes, before I was talking about power and the importance of power analysis. And so, I think that I've had so many principled struggles, debates, conversations, a lot of learning myself with folks over the years about how do we make decisions about where we're getting involved, how we're getting involved, et cetera. I know that there are folks even within About Face that are deeply concerned, have we strayed too far from our mission, right? Are we not emphasizing the very specific intervention of ending the wars enough? And I think that that's a really important question for us to keep coming back to, because it strikes at the heart of what is our right? Of how, like, what is the precise intervention we're trying to make? And that's something we have to, I think, be proactively in conversation about and struggling together around. But here's the way I see it. I've started talking about this as a house of oppression. And I think that when I talk about this, and this has become part of our kind of baseline political education curriculum as new members and folks are coming into About Face. And when we do learning exchanges with other communities, this is something we offer. If we think of a house, right, the purpose of that structure is the roof, is shelter, right? And so if we think about the roof of the structure that we're in, the roof of that structure, and if I'm thinking about systems of oppression here, is economic exploitation. It always has been. When colonizers came to this land, it was, and they, swept through the land with genocide, with, using what was the beginnings of what would eventually become the US Army, to sweep through and take land, to enslave Black and Indigenous peoples. That was about access to resources. That was about economic, the ability to hold territory, which was political, which was economic. And it was about treating bodies as economic resources to be traded and owned and kept, right? Like all of it was about economics. And it was about an exploitative approach to how we relate to the earth, how we relate to human bodies, and how, we relate to each other in economic terms. And that relationship was exploitation and domination. And so if we understand, the kind of structure that we're living in today, the establishment of that structure was always the roof, the purpose of that house was always economic exploitation. That house has to be maintained. Because that exploitation requires a few to maintain domination over a many, right? And so upholding that roof, you have two pillars that are mutually reinforcing. A pillar of racial hierarchy that is predicated on a social ladder or hierarchy that rates you based on your proximity to a political definition of whiteness. And we need to understand whiteness as a political concept, right? It's not actually a skin color. The definition of who is white and what whiteness means has changed throughout history. It's a relatively new concept in terms of human history. And so we have a system of racial hierarchy that is predicated on your proximity to a political definition of whiteness, and that is pitted against a definition of Blackness, which, by the way, Blackness as a concept is fundamentally, in this political dichotomy, was positioned as anti-Indigenous, anti-indigeneity. And so, because you have to remember, Black people are displaced African people, are displaced Indigenous people, right? They were enslaved. And that, that created the diaspora that we know today. So on one hand, you have this pillar. You have another pillar of social hierarchy that is a social hierarchy based on a political definition of what it means to be a man, a cis man, right? And in that, baked into that definition is heteropatriarchy, right? This idea of straightness, these ideas of sexuality, the ideas of sexual control and the domination of the body through the lens of gender and sexuality, just like a system of racial hierarchy based on whiteness is about domination of the body, valuing and devaluing of the body based on your proximity to that whiteness. And so that hierarchy exists as another pillar. Those are twin pillars upholding this roof. They were always meant to stratify society. And in understanding this, we understand that the fundamental purpose of those hierarchies is to maintain a system of economic exploitation that exploits and destroys the land and exploits and destroys our bodies collectively. And when we understand it that way, it becomes impossible for us to separate the need for us to include an understanding of those hierarchies as one of the most effective mechanisms for stratifying working class people for the sake of their own domination. It makes it impossible for us to separate that from our task, which is to unify and empower the working class to take power back, right? In a way that is rooted in right relationship with each other and with the land. On the foundation of this house is militarism. And we understand militarism as a system of political beliefs, political, social, and philosophical beliefs and values. It is not, we distinguish this from militarization, which we think of as the application of things that are typically applied to the military, whether that's equipment, operational tactics and techniques, styles, etc., right, to what are typically non-military functions of society or organizations. And we distinguish that from militancy. Militancy, I define, is as confrontation of power. And yes, for some people, it's uncomfortable for us here in the middle, in the heart of the empire, to swallow the fact that yes, sometimes that militancy, that righteous, just, revolutionary militancy might include violence. I do not advocate for violence. I advocate that we avoid violence at all costs, but it behooves us to, ask ourselves complicated questions about what we would do if you see Indigenous people being mowed down, if you see Black people, if you see working people, etc., being mowed down. Is your answer going to be that I'll sit over here in the corner because I won't participate in violence? Or are you willing to confront that violence? Are you willing to put your body in the line, whether that's in a non-violent way? Are you ready to stop that violence with potentially the most minimal form of violence that you would need to use in order to stop that violence? For me, the answer is yes. I would be willing to do that. I don't expect for that to be, considered the right answer or everybody's answer. But at its core, for me, militancy means a willingness to confront power. And so, we distinguish those ideas, but at the core, the foundation of this house of oppression has always been the enforcement mechanism. The enforcement mechanisms that lays the foundation for those pillars to be maintained when they fail to support each other and keep the roof up. That militarism is the system of ideological beliefs as well as structural mechanisms that cover down. And you can see this evidence every time there's been a powerful people's movement that has risen up, ready to threaten the power structure of economic exploitation at its core. What have we seen the response be? We've seen the response be the literal structural militarism, military response, right, of the National Guard being called out, the military being called out, contracted militarized forces in the case of Standing Rock and other Indigenous struggles ongoing at Line 3, etc. You see the practical structural engine of militarism respond to put those systems back in their place and protect the system of economic exploitation. And you see the philosophical ideas of militarism, the treatment of people's uprisings as terroristic, as violent, right? They're smeared as these dark, dangerous forces, right, that we have to be scared of, and there's a manufactured consent to stop them. And we also see this in the ways that wars are justified abroad, right, or other oppressive actions are justified abroad. So that's a lot, but I think that when you understand these systems in relationship to each other in this way, I think what we haven't done enough of in the anti-war movement is contextualize the relationship between militarism and these other systems. And I think when you understand militarism as fundamentally the enforcement mechanism for these other systems, you start to approach your analysis about what interventions are most powerful for us a little bit differently. And that becomes a really important shining light for how we make decisions together about how we address power in the system and how we take power in the system. So I said a lot else. I have no idea how long that was. I'm sorry if that was too long. But I think that is an important guiding framework for us to think about as we think about our relationship with each other in an ecosystem of working class struggle.
Thanks, Brittany. And I was not about to put a stop sign up on you there. That was great. Sociologists always love structural analyses, and so I love seeing you put the pieces together with the roof and the pillars and the foundations and so forth. So, Ken.
Brittany, excuse me. Brittany started out by saying that we need to be broad in analysis and precise in action. And I agree with that completely. And I think Brittany has mostly been talking about the broad analysis and its root in economic exploitation and so forth. And I'm going to move in a slightly different direction and talking about precise in action and how that relates to how Veterans for Peace in particular can ally itself across these various important movements. And one of the keys to that, I think, lies in Veterans for Peace structure, because we have chapters in most of the United States, and the chapters have different opportunities for action depending on where they're located. For example, here in Santa Fe, we're a few hundred miles from the border, but we can get involved in the border activities more easily than some of the other areas. Also in Santa Fe, we have very few Black members of the community, but only in the last couple of census have whites outnumbered Hispanic members of the population. So we have a very different set of opportunities in which to engage across these important movements. And here in Santa Fe, we have a fabulous group of young people called Youth United for Climate Crisis Action. So we have an opportunity to ally with them. And again, here, I think a key to precise action is heeding the lessons that were included in the allyship session earlier today. But we have a history of at least attempting to work across these. It was about a decade ago, I think, that we came up with the lens of peace at home, peace abroad. And we do see the connections, and it leads us to having delegations abroad at the invitation of other organizations, allied organizations in different parts of the world. And again, I think the lessons of allyship are terribly important to make it effective in trying to connect effectively with these different movements. And I'll stop it at that.
Thank you, Ken. And so the final question, again, sort of parallels the final chapter of the book, where I talk a little bit about the sort of perils and dangers facing VFP as a organization with a fairly aging membership, and the sort of tensions that we've talked about already with some of the younger members of VFP, and also talk about the relationship between VFP and About Face. And so the final question really is kind of looking forward to the future. How do you think the organizations should move forward, and in what kinds of productive dialogue might be created between the membership with About Face and Veterans for Peace? And I know there's already some overlap in the membership to start with. But again, just to reiterate my point, which is that as an associate member especially, I've been so impressed with the work that both of these organizations do, and the importance of the kind of voice that veterans have. I stand with Ken on the corner oftentimes on Fridays here in Santa Fe, and we talk to people as they go by. And when someone asks us a question, I back up and I let Ken and the other veterans answer, because I know they have a platform from which to speak about war and peace issues and nuclear weapons issues. I have an academic standpoint and a moral sort of position on these things, but people listen to veterans on these issues. So it's so important to have a continuing voice. So just asking the question, how do we move forward with VFP, About Face, and the Veterans Peace Movement more generally? Wendy?
Cool. That's a great question. So, I mean, I think my vision for the future would definitely be one where there are no Veterans for Peace. I think we just need to organize ourselves into non-existence. Until that happens, you know, I continue to work towards just abolishing these entire structures, frankly. And I think not least, you know, abolishing DOD, abolishing DHS, abolishing ICE, abolishing CBP. And I think there's something important to be said definitely about something you alluded to earlier, which is like 1 foot in the veteran space and like 1 foot in the in those struggles, right? And that's a balance, right? And I think for a lot of folks, Stan, I think that's for a lot of folks, I think that's too radical when I say like abolish DOD. I know that there's arguments for getting us there. I'm not gonna touch on those right now. But as a person who, you know, comes from the global South, who grew up in the global South and migrated here and continues to work on the violence at the border, continues to work on folks, you know, who need medical care and are refugees here in LA, it's, you know, it's unconscionable. There's no other way for me. So 1 foot in the vet space, and the other foot in these local struggles, right? And I just want to encourage folks that, like, I get the pressure to like do all the things. I've been there. I mean, how many times have I been burnt out? A ton, and trying to recoup from that. But I think that there's a healthy balance, for lack of a better word, in terms of healthy. And I think folks are already doing it. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm more of like that position. And on the militancy tip, I want to recommend to folks kind of a different take, a different point of view, which is a book that we did a study group with at About Face, called Joyful Militancy: How to Build Thriving Resistance During Toxic Times. I think it was really great for my comrades and fellow folks. And then in terms of the possibilities for dialogue and shared purpose, between VFP and About Face, I will leave that to Brittany.
Yeah, I'll be, you know, I think a lot of what I said before lends itself to a shorter answer here. And so I think, like, when we think about the movement the way I was talking about, we think about it as an ecosystem, right? And I think we think a little bit differently about our core task is to unite working class people here and across borders, right? To rise. I think that that's the only way we actually transform the structures that we are all struggling to survive in many cases right now. And so I think when you think about it that way, it's important, you know, people talk a lot about mission. I think missions are good. I think they tend to be broad and not always the most actionable. And I think it's really easy, like when you say, right, like when you say, oh, we're gonna like address equity in a community, like we're gonna like empower the community and make it more equitable. Like no one disagrees with that, right, on its face. I mean, maybe there are some assholes who do, I don't know. But like generally, like you're not gonna get a lot of disagreement with that kind of like general mission. The disagreement comes when power has to change in the way that it flows, when structures have to change, when strategies and tactics have to be decided on, right? And what I've noticed about our movement is that we often spend a lot of time debating these like ideological things as if that is the place of struggle. And I think we don't spend nearly enough time debating our theories of change, our strategies to accomplish those theories of change, and the day-to-day tactics that we are leveraging to move in that direction. And I'll take the case of abolition. I consider myself an abolitionist, and yet I'm often dissatisfied with this, you know, with the tendency, like it's sexy, it's easy to be on social media and be like, abolish, right? Like, and I'm guilty of this. I'm definitely guilty of this. Consider this a self-critique, right? And, you know, it's easy to kind of like just live in that space. It doesn't actually ask you to confront any contradictions. It doesn't ask you to, you know, like to articulate the ways that you're engaging now, how that adds up even in a theoretical vision toward abolition. And I'm dissatisfied with that. I think that there's an empire privilege that exists in our tendency to stay in that space, and not really, going back to my example leading up to the election, I kept having these conversations with folks where I was like, okay, like, you don't agree with the strategy of engaging in strategic voting because both parties are bullshit. I get that. I don't disagree with your premise. So what's your strategy, right? Like, how do we get to political revolution? And so often the answer was something like a general strike. And I was like, dope, I'm down with a general strike. Like, what are you doing to work towards that right now? And also general strike is a tactic. That's not actually a strategy for bringing about a new system of governance, let alone an analysis or, theory about what exactly that system of governance should look like. And I think that, in thinking about these things, it's so important to acknowledge, like, so often then people take a weird left turn and are like, yeah, so therefore trying to address the ways that systems of oppression manifest themselves in our movements and our organizations is a distraction from the real work. And my answer is no, that was a weird left turn from the conversation we were having. Let's come back, because I think that the point of this is that if we're to be rigorous and disciplined about, holding each other to account around, doing the work of thinking about, like, what are the confrontations and the contradictions we have to struggle with in order to bring about a world where abolition is possible, then that means that we have to be practicing. We have to be practicing every day. We have to be practicing systems of decision-making, of governance, of structures, of moving, of formations, and learning about, what are the pitfalls? What are the trade-offs? I am a person who happens to believe that there's no perfect system. And so I think in terms of trade-offs, right? Like, so if we try this, let's learn about what the trade-offs or the struggle points, the weaknesses of that structure are. And let's try this other one, and so, and if we're not confronting those dynamics within our spaces, then we're not actually doing the work of being disciplined revolutionary practitioners moving toward a world of abolition. And so I think that it is at that interpersonal, communal level that we have to be practicing. And then I think when we think about our organizations, it's not just about having a clear mission, it's about having a clear understanding of your particular intervention as part of an ecosystem, right? And so when we think about this at About Face, one of the things we think about is we actually need VFP to exist and be a strong organization in order for About Face to be effective and being precise in the intervention that we are trying to make. We are a small niche of a broader anti-war movement, right? An anti-war veteran movement within that, right? And so when we think about that, we think about Face as the big tent, that is opening welcome arms, right, to any vet who is at the beginning of their journey or deep in their journey, that is like, looking for a home, without too many barriers to get involved or whatever. And that becomes a space for learning, for practicing, for growing, and yes, for mobilizing, and building in mass, right? And we think about the power of VFP as being the power of mass movement. When we think about Face, we're clear that because VFP exists, it would be redundant and weird for us to also be trying to have our intervention be mass veteran movement. So we have gotten clearer and clearer over time, and this has been a fucking struggle. Like, we have gone through several identity crises throughout the history of IVAW and About Face, and I would say it's ongoing, But I think we've gotten clearer and clearer that About Face's best intervention in relationship with ecosystem is to build deep instead of to build mass, right? And so it is a place where we think of ourselves as we have more barriers to entry. We're not actually trying to be a home for all anti-war vets. We have a very precise community that we are organizing, that has a very particularly shared background, and we're doing deep development, deep practice, and deep struggle with each other around how do we leverage the skills and gifts that we have to bring in joy, in militancy, in struggle. It's called a struggle for a reason, and that's not always an external reason, right? And how is that a place where we're really developing core cadre that is deeply skilled, deeply developed, deeply trusted, that can be a gift to the broader movement? And that we are then showing up in solidarity across spaces and very specific, around very specific interventions, and in solidarity with other organizations like VFP. And I think when we think about it that way, we both become more powerful when we're clear, right? Not just about the mission. Our mission is pretty shared, but about the specific intervention toward a theory of change, and what your specific contribution is. So that's what I would, that's how at least I think about movements and ecosystems and how we relate to each other. And, I'm sure that there are a lot of things to add to that, or, valid arguments and critiques back and forth. And I think that the most important thing is that we actually have the conversations and be in principled struggle with each other around those, so that we can all get sharper.
Thanks, Brittany. Ken?
Brittany, that was terrific, and it actually changed the way I was thinking about my answer to the question. A little history. Veterans for Peace has certainly had its ups and downs, and at times we would love to be a mass movement. We're not quite a mass movement. It's not that big, but I get the distinction you're driving at, and I think it's a useful one. And one of my real hopes in promoting this book and having these discussions is that we can work together to make us both more effective in the ecosystem that you described. And I think that's a useful way of looking at it. I would hope that some of that working together, and there are at least a handful of members of both organizations. I'd like to see more about face people join Veterans for Peace and play part of the role that Veterans for Peace does in the ecosystem. One of the ideas I had for promoting that was if we could have some community circles where leadership and about face and leadership for Veterans for Peace could sit down together, learn more about each other, learn more about how our respective organizations operate, and see how we can operate more effectively in the future. I've had sort of a long-term dream of About Face actually becoming About Face : Veterans for Peace. I think you've given me an alternative to look at, instead of having a merged organization, but a more coordinated set of organizations in the ecosystem. But either one of those endpoints, I think, could begin with having some community circle discussions among the leadership, because quite obviously, Veterans for Peace is approaching the end of its best use by date if we don't get a lot more younger members involved in Veterans for Peace and in the chapter activities. I mean, one of the assets that Veterans for Peace has to offer About Face is that we do have chapters in almost every state. And it would be really helpful for the chapters to know what of these, focused, trained members of About Face happen to be residing in proximity, so that we can support them and they can engage in our activities and educate us as well, and particularly educate us with respect to some of the aspects of the first two questions that Mike raised for us. So that's where that's where I'm hoping we can head in terms of benefiting both organizations and contributing to the endurance until we can reach that happy day that Wendy describes in her vision, where we don't have veterans for peace because we don't have veterans. I'll stop.
Thank you, Ken. I wanted to take a moment again to recognize Monisha Rios has put a lot of really good comments into the chat. And I don't know if it's possible, Colleen, for Monisha to join us with her voice, or if Monisha, you want to just write something else in the chat to us. But I did want to mention that the title of the book, Unconventional Combat, really came from one of my interviews with Monisha. And Monisha told me that when she first started coming to Veterans for Peace, that she learned that there was a hierarchy in Veterans for Peace that was similar to the hierarchy in a lot of other veterans organizations. She would be asked, "Are you a combat veteran?" And she had never been deployed. And so she said she realized that if she said, "No, I'm not a combat veteran," that she wouldn't be respected or listened to in the same way that some other veterans might be. But she said she soon learned how to answer that question, which was to say that every day I was in the military, I had to fight to keep from getting raped, and I had to strategize to keep from getting raped. And so, yeah, I was in combat, but I was in unconventional combat. And that kind of perspective, I think, really created a template for me for thinking about the shared understandings of these folks. I see Monisha has appeared on the screen. So Monisha,
I just wanted to make sure, I didn't promote her yet, but I just want to make sure, Monisha, I wasn't sure if you wanted to be visible or just speak. I just want to get your consent on which one you wanted.
Thanks. Just speaking. I'm not ready for public consumption.
All right. Okay, you're up.
Okay, go ahead, Monisha.
Thanks, Mike. Could you actually, I didn't catch the tail end of what the question was.
There really wasn't a question for you. I actually explained how you were the source of the title of the book, Unconventional Combat. And I know you put some really useful things into the chat, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to comment really on anything that we have been speaking about.
Thank you. And I really do want to reiterate how glad I am that this conversation is happening. And thank you, Mike, for initiating the book. I remember our conversations leading up to it, and I'm glad to see that it came to fruition. And I recognize the hard work you put in, as well as the labor of every other person, Wendy, Brittany, Phoenix, Stephen, Zamil, everyone else who participated in its creation as well. It was not easy. And I'm still not able to actually read it really because it's real. And so I originally did feel a lot of anxiety about this happening, and I wasn't sure if I was going to come in or not when I was invited to dip my toes back in the VFP waters. But this is part of the healing that we need to do, the healing work. And you cannot have reconciliation without truth. You cannot have peace without justice. And I think regarding the theme of unconventional combat and leading that up to where that last question of how do we move forward, I think it's important that people who have had access to power and control in the veterans peace movement for as long as they've had it need to be able to tap into their humility, to receive new information, to take that long, hard look in the mirror and look not only at how our interpersonal relationships are working inside of our organizations, but what are we actually doing? Because the thing is that the US military, war, imperialism, all of these things that we say that we're standing up against, we are doing them inside the organization. So it's not a matter of neoliberal identity politics, which is often the reductionism that comes at people like myself who challenge directly the people who are standing next to us and claim that they're our allies. It's not that. It's that I'm a colonized person. A lot of those of us who enter these movement spaces come from war-torn areas. We come from peoples that have been invaded, that have been attacked consistently from before the US was the US. And we have wisdom, we have knowledge, we have awareness that colonizers don't have. Colonizers don't have the answer to colonialism. And that's really, for me, when I was in VFP and going through all of these things that people can read about in the book, it definitely, these were the interpersonal manifestations of colonialism, of war, of militarism, of military rape culture, of white supremacy and patriarchy. But typically it was reduced. It was always, you just have a personal problem with this other person. And instead of other leaders in VFP being able to have that broader view and that deeper analysis of, oh, right, we have a problem here. We're not going to be effective at all in anything that we're doing out in the world until we grapple with this and learn from it and grow from it. And then we will be able to make a better contribution to the global peace movement. But they didn't want to have that conversation. And from what I understand, people are still leaving Veterans for Peace. Even though these conversations are happening, and even though a lot of labor and a lot of work is being done, and it's a slow process, and little by little, people are coming into consciousness, like Ken here, people are still leaving Veterans for Peace because it's still not a safe place. And it's still not a place where that humility exists. And it's still not a place where we can wrestle with that colonizer mentality. Because if we're not doing things the way the white man tells us to do them, violence comes at us in one shape or form or another. So it's really brave. And I'm thankful again, Mike, that you have put yourself out there as a white man in you know, and you're not a veteran too, so that makes it even more courageous for you, in my opinion, that you're sort of helping to hold up the mirror that the rest of us have been trying to hold up for so long, and that we could no longer handle the weight of, while we were under attack at the same time and taking friendly fire. I said in the book that I was hopeful that VFP could eventually move beyond this. And I have to admit, with the aftermath that seems to continue from when so many of us spoke up, I lost hope. And I think that as long as these types of conversations continue and they're followed up with concrete action, not more performance, not more lip service, and not more egotistical, self-serving white man denial, that VFP could move itself into a more ethical place and make a more ethical contribution to the global peace movement. And that's what I hope to see. And I hope that from here, people can continue to connect those dots, that this is also the work. This is not a distraction. It's not a diversion. And we don't have to prove ourselves to you. I saw comments in that book from white male VFP members who had some things to say about the intervention that other women of color and myself tried to do to save y'all from yourselves and to save us more pain and heartache that y'all were causing us. And some of it was just astonishing to me, especially when the comment in particular said, you have to prove that you're not a token. What is that? And so I want to drive home and then I'll be quiet because I don't even know what time it is, but white men are not the measure. You are not the ones who decide what the work is. You do not decide what war is. You do not decide what peace is. You do not decide what decolonization is. You do not decide any of that. That is not your role. When people of color, when colonized peoples come and say, we need to do things differently, your job is to listen and respond appropriately. That is it. That's it. That's it. That's it. Please. It's not that hard. It's difficult and challenging, but it's not hard to have empathy and to be a human being and to recognize that there are limits. You have limits. There are boundaries that you need to respect. And that's what it's really about, is about learning how to respect boundaries and learning how to understand that you don't know everything. You don't have all the answers, and you are not going to save the day. All of us have to do that work together, and all of us have different wisdoms and knowledges to bring to the table. And if there is no room for those wisdoms and knowledges to come to the table, we are not going to accomplish shit. So I'm hoping that with the world that we're facing today, that humility and that love and that empathy and that basic human decency can become the priority in Veterans for Peace, instead of becoming a celebrity and getting photo ops and being in charge and guffawing with your bros and doing all this other nonsense that just wastes our time and resources. When we can be putting our time and resources and labor toward creating actual change, toward addressing the systems of oppression that are keeping war possible, that Brittany talked about, that Wendy talked about, and that so many of us have been talking about for so long, but y'all don't hear us and we leave and we go to spaces where we can be heard and respected and we can actually contribute in a meaningful way. I want VFP to be able to contribute in a meaningful way. So I'll end there, and thank you so much for giving me the chance to speak.
Thank you so much, Juanisha. And I think we're pushing right up toward the top of the hour now, and I think that the only decision I should make here as a white male in the room is to say, let's end on those words, those wise words from Juanisha Rios, and just join in thanking all the panelists for all of these thoughtful comments and challenges, really, that all of us, I think, need to take very seriously and continue to talk about for the next few days together in the meetings, but also as we move forward in the future. Thank you very much.
Just want to give it a minute to let that sink in a moment. It's Brittany, Wendy, Juanisha, thank you for your courage. Thank you for giving us that. Ken, thanks for being on the panel. Standing, being accountable for Veterans for Peace as a board member. And Michael, thanks for all your work and your writing and the interviews and the research. If folks want to continue discussion, the community room is open. We are going to have a president's reception later. So feel free to utilize that space up until then. And I imagine even in the president's reception, we're going to have these conversations. There's going to be executive committee board members, and myself there, the leadership of this organization, and we need to be held accountable. So look forward to hearing from you and your suggestions, and let's take this to heart. We need to seriously look at what we're doing as an organization, how we create peace in this world. And I think we can do it. There's still, over 3,000 of us internationally, veterans who've seen and understand combat, supported combat around the world, and did so much harm. If we do so much harm to people and realize that overseas, why can't we see the harm that we do in our own communities? And that's a moral injury that we keep on inflicting on ourselves because we fail to learn these lessons that Monisha, Britt, Wendy keep teaching us. So let's try, let's listen, and just love each other more. So we'll see you all in the social room. Thanks again, everyone.